The morning sun had barely risen over the industrial yard when Marcus adjusted his work gloves and stepped onto the gravel path that led toward the construction site. His boots pressed firmly into the earth, each step a reminder of years of discipline, perseverance, and survival in a world that often seemed determined to test the limits of his dignity. Marcus was one of the few black workers on the site, and though his years of experience made him one of the most skilled men on the ground, his presence often drew the kind of glances that weren't about respect but about suspicion. He had learnt to carry himself with quiet resilience, shoulders squared, eyes steady, knowing that to falter even for a moment might give others an excuse to dismiss him. The crew were gathering near the scaffolding when he arrived, their voices carrying over the sharp metallic clang of tools being unpacked. Engineers in crisp white helmets and clean reflective vests clustered together, their words clipped and brisk, as though they were narrating the blueprint of an empire only they could envision. Marcus approached with a nod of acknowledgement, his face neutral, but inside he reminded himself that today would be no different from yesterday. Another day of hard labor, another day of proving, without ever saying it, that he belonged here as much as anyone else. Yet from the very beginning, there was a tension that hung in the air like a storm threatening to break. The lead engineer, a tall man with narrow eyes and a sharp voice named Collins, stood with two others, scanning the workers. When his gaze landed on Marcus, it lingered, narrowing in a way that made Marcus feel as though every step he took, every move of his hands, would be scrutinized with the kind of cold precision that had nothing to do with safety or efficiency. Collins was known for his harshness, but with Marcus, that harshness often sharpened into humiliation disguised as discipline. The first few hours passed with the rhythm Marcus knew so well, lifting, securing, measuring, tightening. His body moved like a machine trained over decades, yet always infused with the careful awareness that separated a true craftsman from someone merely following orders. Around him, younger workers looked to him quietly for cues, often mimicking his pace, watching how he navigated the tricky balance of speed and accuracy. Marcus never asked for their admiration, but he carried it like an invisible mantle, knowing that in silence, they recognized his worth. It wasn't until midday, when the sun hung heavy and relentless overhead, that the moment came. The crew had gathered near the central platform to adjust the steel beams being aligned for the next phase of construction. The engineers stood above, on a makeshift platform, barking out instructions, their voices echoing across the yard. Marcus was holding one end of the beam, steadying it while a younger worker secured the bolts. Sweat poured down his face, but his grip was unshaken. That's when Collins' voice sliced through the air. "Hey, yeah, you Marcus," Collins called, his tone dripping with disdain. "Are you even paying attention? You're holding it wrong. If you can't manage something this simple, maybe this isn't the job for you." The words froze the air around them. Dozens of eyes turned toward Marcus, and for a moment, the weight of the beam seemed lighter than the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. He looked up slowly, his dark eyes meeting Collins' sharp glare. He knew he wasn't holding it wrong. He had been doing this for years, long before Collins had even set foot on a site like this. But saying so would mean confrontation, and confrontation was a game that could cost him more than his pride. Still, Collins wasn't finished. "Look at him," he sneered, turning to the other engineers, then projecting his voice so every worker could hear. "Always so slow, always pretending like he knows better. I swear, some people just don't get it. You give them a chance, and they prove why they shouldn't be here in the first place." The word stung, not just because of the insult, but because everyone knew what Collins meant. It wasn't about the beam, and it wasn't about the pace. It was about Marcus being a black man in a space where people like Collins believed he didn't belong. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken tension of workers who saw the injustice, but feared speaking against authority. Marcus felt the eyes on him, some sympathetic, some indifferent, and a few that carried the subtle smirk of agreement with Collins. Marcus could have exploded in that moment. Years of swallowed words, years of biting his tongue in the face of disrespect, years of carrying his dignity like a shield. It would have been so easy to let it all loose. But instead, he straightened his shoulders, adjusted his grip on the beam, and with a voice steady and calm, he said, "I'm holding it exactly as it needs to be held. The job will be done right." The simplicity of his words contrasted with the venom of Colin's insult. And though he didn't raise his voice, the quiet firmness carried across the yard like the echo of a drumbeat. The younger worker beside him glanced up with something like awe, as though he had just witnessed a man reclaim his dignity in the face of humiliation. But Collins, unwilling to let the moment slip, stepped forward and barked again. "Don't talk back to me. You don't know your place. I'll have you off this site if you don't watch yourself." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Marcus looked at him, unblinking. He didn't move, didn't respond, and didn't give Collins the satisfaction of seeing him break. And in that silence, something shifted, not just for Marcus, but for everyone watching. Because in that silence, the truth became undeniable. Collins wasn't exposing Marcus' incompetence. He was exposing his own prejudice. Minutes later, when the project manager arrived unexpectedly on site, the tension was still palpable. The manager, a woman with sharp eyes who missed nothing, had heard the echoes of Collins' voice long before she appeared. She walked with the kind of authority that didn't need to shout, and, as she asked what was going on, no one dared to speak. But silence, too, tells a story. The way the workers avoided her gaze, the way Marcus stood tall but weary, the way Collins smirked as though certain he had won. All of it painted a picture clearer than any words could. The manager's questions cut swiftly, and the truth unraveled. It wasn't the first time Collins had belittled Marcus. It wasn't the first time his words had crossed the line from authority into abuse. And it wasn't the first time the crew had been forced to watch a man's dignity stripped away for no reason other than the color of his skin. The weight of that truth could not be hidden, and in the quiet testimonies that followed, it became clear that Collins had not acted alone. The engineers had fostered an environment where humiliation was currency and prejudice was policy. And in a decision that shocked everyone, the manager announced that effective immediately, the engineers responsible for the harassment were dismissed, fired on the spot. Their authority was stripped as quickly as they had tried to strip Marcus of his dignity. The murmurs that rippled through the crew were filled with disbelief, relief, and something else, pride. Pride that justice, for once, had not been delayed or denied. Marcus didn't smile, though inside he felt a tide rising within him. He simply set down the beam, removed his gloves, and walked toward the break area with the steady grace of a man who had endured, who had survived yet another battle in the long war for respect. Behind him, the site buzzed with whispers, but one truth stood above them all. The man they had tried to humiliate had stood taller than all of them. And in the end, the ones who had mocked him were the ones brought low. The site grew quiet in the hours after the engineers were escorted out. It was the kind of silence that felt almost unnatural for a place usually filled with the clamor of hammers, drills, and shouted instructions. Workers continued with their tasks, but the rhythm had changed. Every clang of steel, every hum of machinery seemed softer, almost cautious, as if the entire crew were adjusting to a new order they had never imagined possible. For Marcus, the silence carried both weight and release, like the long exhale after holding one's breath for too long. He sat at the edge of the break area, the shade of the scaffolding offering little relief from the heat, but enough for him to gather himself. His gloves lay on the bench beside him, and his hands, calloused strong, marked with the story of years, rested on his knees. He didn't feel victorious, not exactly. What he felt was something more complicated, exhaustion mixed with vindication, sorrow intertwined with pride. To stand tall against humiliation had not been a choice for him. It had been survival. But to see justice arrive, swift and undeniable, was something rare. The younger worker who had stood beside him earlier approached hesitantly, holding a bottle of water. His name was Diego, a boy no older than 22, with nervous eyes that carried both admiration and fear. "You good, man?" he asked softly, offering the bottle. Marcus accepted it with a small nod, twisting off the cap and taking a long sip before replying. "I'm fine. Just another day." Diego shook his head. Nah, that wasn't just another day. I've never seen anything like that. The way you stood there, the way you didn't let him break you. I'll never forget it. Marcus looked at him, his eyes steady but kind. You don't need to remember me, Diego. You just need to remember what's right. Don't let anybody tell you you're less than who you are. That's the real fight. The words lingered in the young man's mind, and he nodded slowly, as though etching them into his memory. Around them, other workers glanced over, some with cautious smiles, some with silent nods of respect. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something shift, not just for himself, but for everyone. By the end of the day, the story had already spread beyond the site. Construction crews from neighboring projects heard about the engineers who had been fired for humiliating a black worker. In lunch trucks and neighborhood bars, the story became the talk of the town. Some dismissed it as exaggerated gossip, others as justice finally served. But for those who had witnessed it, the memory was sharp and real. The look on Colin's face as he realized his authority was crumbling, the sound of the project manager's firm voice, and the sight of Marcus standing steady in the middle of it all. When Marcus returned home that evening, the weight of the day followed him like a shadow. His small apartment was modest but filled with reminders of his life. Photographs of family members, some gone, some far away. Books stacked on the table, many of them dog-eared with passages he had read again and again. A worn Bible resting on the nightstand. He lowered himself into the armchair by the window, the leather creaking under his weight, and let the silence of home wash over him. He thought of his grandmother, who had raised him with stories of survival and dignity. Never let a man take your soul. Marcus, she used to say. They can take your job, they can take your money, but don't ever let them take who you are. Today, her voice felt louder than ever, echoing in his heart. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. It was his sister, Tanya, her voice full of concern. I heard what happened. Are you okay? Marcus hesitated. I'm fine. Just another day at work. Don't do that, Tanya said firmly. Don't brush it off. What they did to you, it wasn't right. But you stood tall and people saw that. Do you know how many of us carry that humiliation in silence? You spoke without yelling, and you stood without bowing. That matters, Marcus. It matters more than you think. Her words struck him deeply. He realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about every worker who had been mocked, and every black man or woman who had been dismissed, silenced, or disrespected. In his silence, in his refusal to bend, he had carried not just his own dignity, but the dignity of many who had come before him. The next morning, the site felt different. Without the engineer's looming presence, the crew moved with a new rhythm. The project manager, aware of the gravity of what had happened, took a more active role in overseeing operations. She spoke to the workers with respect, listening instead of dictating and observing instead of condemning. And though she never said it outright, her actions made it clear. What had happened yesterday would not be repeated. Still, not everyone was at ease. Some workers whispered in corners, uneasy about what the firings might mean for the project. Others looked at Marcus with a mix of respect and resentment, as though his dignity had cost them their comfort. Prejudice doesn't disappear in a day, Marcus knew, but for now, at least, it had been silenced. At lunchtime, a small group of workers gathered around him. Diego was there, along with a few others who had quietly admired Marcus for years. One of them, an older man named Samuel, spoke up. I've been on sites like this for 30 years, he said, his voice rough with age and labor. I've seen a lot of men like Collins come and go. They bark orders, they humiliate, and they break people down. But I've never seen anyone fire them for it. Yesterday was the first time. Marcus nodded slowly. Maybe it won't be the last. The men exchanged looks, a quiet agreement passing between them. For the first time, they felt the possibility of change. Not a revolution, not an overnight transformation, but a crack in the wall that had stood for too long. As the days passed, Marcus noticed how the younger workers carried themselves differently. They walked with more confidence and spoke with more assurance. It was as if his moment of defiance had given them permission to believe in their own strength. And while Marcus didn't seek to be a leader, he found himself becoming one in silence. his presence a reminder that dignity was not negotiable. One evening, as the crew packed up, the project manager approached him. "Marcus," she said, her tone softer than usual, "I wanted to thank you. What happened? What you endured? It exposed something we can't ignore. I don't know if you realize it, but you changed this site." Marcus looked at her, his expression steady. "I didn't change it. The truth did. I just didn't let it pass me by." Her eyes lingered on him for a moment. Then she nodded, as though acknowledging something greater than words could express. But change, Marcus knew, was fragile. And while the firing of the engineers had sent a message, there would be those who resisted it, those who waited for a chance to restore the old order. For now, however, the site belonged to the workers, the men and women whose sweat and labor built structures that would stand for generations. And in that moment, Marcus understood something profound. Dignity, once defended, does not belong to the individual alone. It becomes a light for others to follow, a shield for those still fighting, and a seed for justice yet to come. The city seemed to move at its usual pace, cars rushing down cracked streets, neon signs flickering to life in corner shops, and voices rising in crowded markets. But for Marcus, the world carried a different weight now. The incident at the site had traveled faster than he imagined, spreading like wildfire beyond the fences of steel and concrete where it had begun. In churches and barber shops, on sidewalks and stoops, people repeated the story. A black worker humiliated, a cruel insult thrown in front of everyone, and then justice sudden and undeniable. At first, Marcus avoided the conversations. He didn't see himself as a symbol, and he wasn't hungry for recognition. He had only done what he believed any man should do, refused to bow to humiliation. But the truth was, many had bowed before. They had endured in silence, because silence was safer, because feeding your children mattered more than fighting for your pride. Marcus understood that silence all too well. He had lived it many times. And so, when he walked into his neighborhood cafe one morning and heard two older men talking about him without realizing he was only a few tables away, he felt something stir inside him. "They say he didn't even raise his voice," one man said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Didn't curse, didn't break down, just stood there, calm as stone. And then the engineers, gone like dust. I've never heard of something like that happening." The other man leaned back, his eyes narrowing with thought. "That's how it starts. You hold your ground without breaking, and the world sees the truth. Maybe folks will think twice before trying something like that again." Marcus lowered his eyes, quietly sipping his coffee, his heart swelling with both pride and unease. He hadn't asked to be anyone's story, but now he was one. Back at the site, the changes were subtle but undeniable. The crew moved differently, not out of fear, but out of respect, for one another, for themselves. There was less shouting, fewer sneers, and more cooperation. Marcus noticed the younger workers stepping up with ideas, offering suggestions where before they had stayed silent. Diego, once timid and unsure, now spoke with confidence, his words carrying the weight of someone who believed his voice mattered. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the steel beams with streaks of orange, Samuel approached Marcus with a thoughtful look. "You know, boy," he said in his gravelly voice, "what you did wasn't just for you. You changed the way these kids see themselves. They're walking taller because of you." Marcus smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I didn't change them. They already had it in them. Maybe they just needed a reminder." Samuel chuckled, slapping Marcus lightly on the shoulder. Sometimes a reminder is all it takes. But not everyone was pleased with the shift. A handful of workers who had quietly agreed with Colin's prejudices now looked at Marcus with thinly veiled resentment. They grumbled in corners, muttered about how the project was losing discipline, and claimed that workers were getting too bold. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, sharp and watchful, waiting for him to slip. He knew that prejudice doesn't die when one man is fired. It lingers like smoke after a fire, clinging to everything it touches. The project manager seemed to sense this tension too. She made a point of checking in with Marcus more often, though always under the guise of discussing the work. Her presence was steady, her leadership firmer than ever. One evening, As the last of the crew packed up, she lingered by Marcus's station. "You've carried yourself with more strength than most men could manage," she said quietly. "But I need you to understand something. What happened isn't the end of the fight. It's the beginning. People are watching now. Some will respect you. Others will resent you. You'll have to decide what you do with that." Marcus nodded slowly, her words settling over him like a mantle. He hadn't chosen to be a leader, but sometimes leadership chooses you. That night, Marcus walked home through streets alive with laughter and music from open windows. Children played on sidewalks, their joy unburdened by the struggles of adulthood. He paused at a mural painted on the side of a building, a vibrant piece depicting black men and women of the city, arms raised in resilience, eyes full of determination. He stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of history pressing against his chest. His grandmother's voice rose again in his mind. "They can't take who you are, Marcus. Hold on to that." The following week, a local journalist showed up at the site. She had heard the story and wanted to speak with Marcus. At first, he resisted. "I'm just a worker," he told her firmly. "I don't want my face in the paper." But the journalist persisted. "People need to hear your voice. Not just the story as others tell it, but from you. What you endured and what it means to stand your ground." Marcus wrestled with the idea. He wasn't comfortable with the spotlight. He preferred the quiet dignity of his work. But as he thought of Diego, of Samuel, of the whispers in the cafe, he realized the story was no longer just his. If his silence meant others would continue to endure humiliation alone, then perhaps his voice could be a shield for them. When the article was published, it spread quickly. The headline read, "Workers' Dignity Leads to Engineers Firing, a Stand Against Humiliation." The piece described Marcus not as a victim, but as a man who refused to bend. His calm defiance, his quiet strength, it became a symbol of resilience for many who had lived through similar pain. Calls began coming into the project office, some from unions, others from community leaders, even pastors. They wanted Marcus to speak, to share his story, to help spark conversations about dignity in the workplace. At first, the requests overwhelmed him. He wasn't an activist. He was a man who put on his gloves each day and worked with his hands. But slowly, he began to see the power of his experience, not as a performance, but as truth. At a small church gathering one Sunday evening, Marcus finally spoke publicly. Standing at the pulpit, his voice steady but humble, he recounted the moment of humiliation, the silence that followed, and the dignity he had chosen to hold on to. "They try to strip me down in front of everyone," he said. "But I knew if I let that happen, it wouldn't just be me who lost. It would be every one of us who's ever been told we don't belong." So I stood. Not because I'm stronger, not because I'm braver, but because sometimes you don't have a choice but to protect your dignity. And when you do, you protect others too. The congregation erupted in applause, some with tears in their eyes. And in that moment, Marcus realized his story was no longer his own. It had become part of something larger, a collective fight for respect, justice, and humanity. But as his voice grew louder in the community, so too did the resistance. Whispers reached him that Collins and the other engineers were contesting their firing, claiming discrimination against themselves. They painted themselves as victims, saying Marcus had been given special treatment because of his race. The irony was sharp, but the danger real. Prejudice often fights hardest when it feels its power slipping. Marcus knew the road ahead would not be easy. He could already feel the weight of scrutiny pressing against him, the eyes that once looked past him now watching his every move. But he also felt something else, an unshakable truth that no one could take from him. He had stood tall when it mattered most. And once a man learns to stand tall, no force on earth can make him kneel again. The weeks that followed were heavy with both progress and unease. The site had taken on a new rhythm, steadier and calmer than before. Without the engineers looming overhead, the workers collaborated more freely, trusting one another in ways they hadn't dared before. Tasks that once felt like battles will became smoother, faster, more humane. Yet beneath the harmony lay a quiet tension, the lingering awareness that change often invites resistance. That resistance came swiftly. Collins and the other dismissed engineers filed formal complaints, arguing they had been wrongfully terminated. Their claims twisted the truth, painting Marcus not as a man humiliated, but as someone who had provoked them, someone who had played the race card. In their version, they were the victims disciplined unfairly in the name of political correctness. Their words slithered into boardrooms and court filings, and soon, whispers began to spread back through the industry. Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. When the project manager called him into her office, her face was grave. "They're trying to undo this," she told him plainly. "They're calling you a troublemaker, saying you set them up. I won't let them rewrite what happened, but you need to be prepared. They're not going to go quietly." Marcus sat across from her, his hands folded in his lap. "I've been called worse," he said, his voice steady, "but I won't let them take the truth from me. Not this time." The manager studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then we'll stand together." News of the engineers' appeal spread quickly, and the community rallied around Marcus. Workers from other sites signed petitions. Union leaders issued statements, and pastors spoke his name from pulpits as a man whose dignity was worth defending. Marcus found himself standing in front of crowds he never imagined addressing, telling and retelling the story not because he wanted to, but because the truth demanded repetition. Each time he spoke, he reminded himself of Diego's eyes that day, wide with admiration, and of Samuel's words, "You changed the way these kids see themselves." One night, after returning home from yet another community meeting, Marcus sat in his armchair, staring out the window. The city lights flickered against the glass, and the noise of traffic rose from the street below. He thought of his grandmother again, of the long line of men and women who had endured humiliation silently because survival demanded it. He thought of how many times he had himself swallowed bitterness to keep food on the table. And he thought of how different this moment was. For the first time, silence hadn't been the only option. The legal battle stretched on for weeks, but the truth held firm. Witness after witness stepped forward. Workers who had once been afraid to speak, now testifying about the pattern of abuse they had endured from Collins and his crew. Their courage was unshaken, inspired by the stand Marcus had taken. The weight of testimony grew too heavy to ignore, and finally, the ruling was handed down. The firings were upheld. Collins and the others would not return. The news broke like a wave across the community. In bars and cafes, in church halls and neighborhood gatherings, people spoke of it not just as a workplace dispute, but as a moment of justice, a symbol of what happens when truth is defended and dignity is preserved. For Marcus, it was a relief, but more than that, it was confirmation that his refusal to bow had not been in vain. The following Sunday, Marcus found himself once again in the small church where he had first spoken. The pastor invited him to the front, and though Marcus hesitated, the congregation's applause carried him forward. Standing before them, he felt the weight of eyes upon him, not as a burden, but as a bond. "I never wanted to be a story," Marcus began, his voice deep and calm. "I just wanted to do my job, to work with my hands, to carry my dignity quietly. But sometimes life doesn't give you the choice of quiet. Sometimes you're forced into a moment where you must decide. Do I let them take who I am, or do I stand? I chose to stand. Not because I'm better than anyone else, but because I couldn't bear to look in the mirror if I didn't." His words hung in the air, met by the stillness of those who understood. He continued, his voice growing stronger. "What happened on that site wasn't just about me. It was about every man and woman who has ever been humiliated for the color of their skin, for their background, for simply existing in spaces others think they don't belong. When we stand, we don't just stand for ourselves. We stand for everyone who comes after us." The congregation rose to their feet, the sound of clapping and shouts, of amen, filling the sanctuary. Marcus bowed his head slightly, humbled by the response. For the first time, he allowed himself to smile. Not the weary smile of survival, but the genuine smile of a man who knew his struggle had meaning. In the months that followed, Marcus continued his work on the site, but his life had expanded beyond it. He became a quiet figure of respect in the community, invited to speak at schools, at union halls, even at city council meetings. Always, he spoke with the same humility, reminding people that he was not extraordinary, that dignity was within everyone's reach, that strength was not in loudness, but in standing firm. Diego, the young worker who had once stood beside him trembling with uncertainty, grew into a leader in his own right. Under Marcus's mentorship, he learned not just the craft of construction, but the craft of carrying oneself with pride. Years later, Diego would tell others, "Marcus taught me that the job is about more than steel and stone. It's about building yourself, brick by brick, into a man no one can tear down." For Marcus, life did not suddenly become easy. Prejudice remained, challenges continued, and the world outside the construction yard was still filled with battles to be fought. But he carried within him an unshakable truth. Dignity, once defended, can never truly be taken. It lives on in those who witness it, in those who are inspired by it, in those who learn to stand because they saw someone else refuse to fall. And so the story of Marcus, the black worker humiliated by engineers in front of everyone, only to see them fired minutes later, became more than just a tale whispered over coffee or reported in the papers. It became a legacy, a story parents told their children, workers told each other on long shifts, pastors wove into sermons, and young men carried in their hearts when they faced their own trials. Marcus himself remained the same man he had always been, steady, humble, committed to his work. But around him, the world had shifted, if only slightly. And sometimes, a slight shift is enough to change the course of history. Because when a man refuses to bow, when he protects his dignity in the face of humiliation, he does more than defend himself. He opens a door for others to walk through. He becomes proof that justice, though delayed, can arrive. And he leaves behind a light that no darkness can fully extinguish.